Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Today's guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder podcast is Marc Ireland. Marc is the co-founder of Helping Parents Heal. He's a best-selling author, and he's also the son of a famous medium, Richard Ireland. He's paved his own path within his own research of afterlife phenomenon and mediumship, and is here to talk about his own background and his legacies and stories that he has to share, talking all things of the hereafter. So without further ado, it's my distinct honor to welcome Marc Ireland on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. Marc Ireland, it's an honor to have you here on my podcast, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I've been a big fan of your work and your affiliation with Helping Parents Heal. But for those viewers who may not have heard you, I know you've been really on the radar for quite some time, but could you tell us a little bit about your current work and your current focus these days? As I know you have a wonderful new book out that I see, The Persistence of the Soul, and you're written another book too as well. So you do a lot of work, but you could describe it a lot better than I can. Just maybe could you summarize a little bit about yourself and your work for my viewers, because I find you fascinating.
Thanks. I'm kind of a Renaissance man or a jack of all trades, whichever you choose to call me, because I do a lot of different things. I actually still have a full-time job in the corporate world, but my passion is really two things. It's Helping Parents Heal, which is an organization I co-founded that assists bereaved parents. And then I'm also an author. I've published a few books, primarily focused on psychic phenomena, mediumship, and afterlife evidence.
Wow.
And really what pushed me into that was a couple of things. My father was a pretty prominent, famous psychic medium back mainly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then my youngest son passed unexpectedly at the age of 18. And so I didn't really follow my father's footsteps. But after that happened, it kind of pulled me out of the mainstream search for satisfaction in the corporate world and advancement and all that into his field, and to look for how I could be of service to other people. And that's, I guess, a Reader's Digest version of what I'm doing now.
I see. So for you, I mean, and obviously my sincere condolences for the passing of your loss, but it seemed like that pain in a way, or that was like a shakeup for you to reevaluate, this life and death stuff. Is that kind of what happened to you?
It was definitely the catalyst. Yes. I
Mm.
think we all kind of go through life, and I think we all have a path, but sometimes something shakes us up and has us reassess what we're doing, where we're headed, what we're focused on, and what we should be doing, and how our life could unfold. And that's definitely true for me, because that really pulled me into a direction I never really anticipated going. Even though I was always proud of my father and his work and his abilities, and had a confidence in there being more than just physical existence because of things I saw and grew up with. Um, I guess I didn't want to be my dad, or I didn't feel I had the same level of abilities, even though they've spontaneously popped up here and there. So it definitely pushed me into that path. And I think it's been very rewarding. I mean, to go through something so painful, which is, I think, the hardest thing any parent or any person probably could go through in their life. But to know that there was some good to come of it on the back end, that,
Mm.
for one thing, I think for me going through that, I can relate to people who have gone through it. If you haven't been through that, it's really hard to understand. And it's not anything anyone wants, but it definitely gave me a perspective that I could use to help other folks. And then all these things that have unfolded just almost naturally through synchronicity since then. My meeting with researchers in this field, my meeting with top mediums in the field, the formation of and expansion of Helping Parents Heal, our conferences now, which are drawing 1,000 people and taking place every other year, bringing tremendous healing. And then being able to get books published and out to thousands and thousands of people, and hearing from people around the world, and that those things have helped them, and some cases prevented people from taking their own lives, is what they've told
Mm.
me. And then keeping my dad's legacy going. So it's been an interesting journey.
To say the least. And obviously your reach is very broad based, and your work with helping parents heal, and as an author, you're helping a lot of people. And like many of my guests, you're using a lot of personal experience and pain that seem to fulfill or fuel a sense of purpose and meaning, or more meaning that you have today. But I'm wondering for you, you mentioned your father, which we'll get into in a little bit. Um, but was there like a point that you could look at that said, wow, this is a thing? I really believe that there is an afterlife. Or did you always believe in it, even, with your father's work? Or how did that transition happen?
I would say I always believed in it because of my father's work back from the time I was a kid, a young kid. I would see him doing demonstrations of both psychic phenomena and mediumship.
Mm,
And when I'd see, the psychic stuff was cool, but when he would spontaneously go into the mediumship and connect with someone who would pass with highly specific information like first and last names, um, details about the relationship with the person he was giving the message to, maybe favorite hobbies or foods or other things that would signify who that person was and the relationship that were important to that, what I call a sitter, which is the recipient of the information. As a kid, that just made me smile and feel so full, like there really is more. It's not
mm,
just this surface level existence. I couldn't understand how it worked. I didn't, get that completely. I don't know that anyone has a full explanation, but
mm.
it did give me that confidence. And I think, even though I shelved my interest in that field, I still was proud of my dad, and I would take friends to see him and kind of open their minds up a little bit. And then, when I got back into it, I think it was at a different level. I wanted a connection with my son who had passed. I wanted to be first the recipient of that, not just for, I didn't need the evidence as much as most people would. That was obviously nice to have, but I wanted that sense of connection, what Julie Beischel of Winbridge calls continuing bonds.
Mm.
And it's the idea that, a lot of therapists in their approach to grief recovery have focused more on like shelving this or putting it out of your mind, as opposed to this continuing bonds theory, which is more focused on the idea that they still exist, and you can still have a relationship in a way. It's just different. It's not going to be the same as it was before. And it seems to be a lot more successful in terms of healing grief and helping people move forward into having productive lives.
I think that's a beautiful point, because in a lot of my work, and I work in the field of mental health, we view things in a box. And I think for when we lose a loved one, if that box is underground or that's how we see our loved one, it's a very morose reality. But like you said, when there's a possibility of a continual relationship, that could allow someone to propel their own lives and really go through their grief. But I'm wondering for you, have you found in your own personal and professional life a strong relationship with connecting to the afterlife and grief? Is that something that you have noticed, or, do you feel like there's a big correlationship with the two?
I think it's a factor in someone's healing to be able to move forward. There are a number of things. I've got what I call the 5 pillars of healing. I don't know if you've heard me say anything about that in the past, but it's probably a lot of the same things you talk about. Having support from family and friends, assuming you have a a family that's well balanced and able to be there for you. Meeting people who have been through the same thing as you and can relate to you, and forging those relationships can help a lot. Uh, Providing service to others, being of service when you're ready, when you can do that, because what you give out comes back to heal you too, and takes your mind off of the self-absorbed kind of ongoing feelings of sadness and isolation. Um, Letting go of feelings of guilt. So many parents I talk to, I'm sure you see this, they blame themselves. Oh, I could have done this. I could have done that. I should have seen the signs. They all will do that. And it serves no purpose. It just hurts them and holds them back. So they got to get to a point of letting go of that. Um, Harboring anger and not forgiving someone they hold accountable for that, whether it be a medical professional, someone who was involved in an accident that took the life of their child. Sure, this is probably the hardest thing to ask somebody to consider doing, but ultimately they're the person being hurt by harboring that and not letting go of that guilt, those feelings of anger and non-forgiveness. If they can get to that point and do that, it will help them. And then the last point being a hope element. And that comes, from being open to considering evidence for consciousness being primary and continuing after death, not buying into what our society's been brainwashed to think of as reality, of the physicalism, materialism, like matter came first, brain creates consciousness, and when brain's gone, consciousness is gone. It's kind of the other way around. Consciousness had to be here first for the material world to happen, to exist. Quantum physics points us out through the observer effect, mind over matter.
Sure.
So those are kind of the factors that I look at in terms of somebody healing. And I would say, yeah, they've been very helpful to me. My wife and I and my family healed much faster than most people I know, because the basis that we had, that we started from. And early on, I had all kinds of connections and crazy experiences that confirmed that my son still existed. Probably not as many now, because I don't feel the need, and I know he's got an ongoing life in another realm or dimensional reality. So it's not just like he's, waiting to make me happy all the time. But I do definitely get signs and connections and things from him periodically. And I think I'm further down my own path now, whereas some people maybe aren't as far along.
Why do you feel it is that some people get more signs than others? Is it that people are believing this stuff, they're paying attention? Because I know a lot of clients come to me, they say, Jacob, I'm not seeing anything from my loved one. And then others are like, oh my God, it's like, every single day I just go into my house and my lights are flickering. Like, why is it that some seem to notice or attract more signs than others? Why do you feel that is?
It seems like these phenomena occur more often with people who are maybe a little more sensitive and open and aware. Because think about it this way: we live in a world where we're inundated with media, whether it be computer, smartphone, music, TV, on and on and on. And when my dad grew up, he grew up in a rural Ohio, no radio, no telephone, nothing. So he had all this free time to go out in the woods. So he was much more in tune with nature and more subtle information. So I think sometimes these are subtle things that you get if it's an intuitive feeling or some sort of connection, or like maybe something drops into your awareness. But as far as other types of signs, it's hard to say. I mean, you have to be aware. It's not like you just want to say everything's a sign, because some people will do that just to make themselves feel good. I think you kind of know when something is very unusual and synchronistic, and it means something, as opposed to just assigning something. But I think you have to be open to it too, and you have to be aware. And some people just kind of go down their life without really being aware of everything. I remember my dad talking about, and in his training materials for psychic development, even, like, people are unaware just of their surroundings at any given point in time. So he would say, if he had a room full of people, he'd say, okay, everybody shut your eyes. Okay, what color was the carpet? Things like that. And people won't be aware of that. They wouldn't think about it. Or, the person next to you, what color hair do they have? What were their eye color? It's just this outer awareness first, that we kind of go through life as a zombie sometimes. And so that level of awareness is maybe the lowest. And then the next level would be being aware of more subtle things. And I've had that come to me through some kind of unusual experiences as well, having those kind of subtle messages and things come to that turned out to be pretty significant.
Would you call that like intuition that you've experienced, like intuitive, hints that some of these messages that have come to you?
Yes, I'd say some were intuitive, some were psychic, and some were even mediumistic. And I didn't try to control them. I just took them for what they were. The first one was just days after my son passed. And I wanted a connection. I wanted a direct connection. So I went into a walk-in closet, shut the door, turned off the light, sat down, and quietly asked for a connection to my son. And within a reasonable period of time, I saw his face scroll across I saw him through my mind's eye. He was smiling and glowing. I felt joy, happiness, which made me feel great. And I was satisfied with that alone. But then right after that, I saw a cross with an oval loop at the top. And I thought, I've seen those before, but I didn't know what it meant. So then when I was done, I went and had to Google it, found out it's the Ankh, which is the oldest cross of human history, dating back about 5,000 years to the Egyptians, with the lower portion representing physical life and the oval loop representing eternal life. So
Wow.
to me, I got a coded message that my son was joyful and he was in the afterlife. Now, if I'm kind of a rational, somewhat analytic person, I'm balanced, but I do have that element to me.
Right.
A little bit of skepticism is healthy. So had I already known what that symbol meant, I could have just said, well, my subconscious mind was helping me feel good, making me feel good. But no, I got this puzzle I had to go solve. And then I found out the meaning assigned to it that went along with the image of my son. So that's something anybody could try and do, and you could do it before going to bed at night too. I've had a dream visit with my son that was more real than waking reality. And that night before going to bed, I asked for a visit. And I also asked to be able to remember it later, because sometimes think about dreams that you have that might be very impactful. But if you don't write down what they were, as soon as you wake up, you forget what happened.
Right. Sure. Sure. I always suggest people to have like a yellow Lego pad next to their bed so that they could remember it. But more importantly, they could find their own meaning and connection. But, uh, it seems like from what you're saying, the quieter that we become, the more that we could notice. Is that kind of what,
Yeah,
you know,
you got it.
a lot
Dead
of us?
on. I'm shooting
Yeah.
right on.
What was that like for you? I mean, I'm sure it's very raw to experience that, but once you experience that, knowing that your son is with you and there was undeniable signs for you, what did that do on your own personal journey?
Well, it was great. I mean, it just made me feel at a time of deep sorrow and grief, a warmness, a little bit of joy, a little piece of joy, and then I could share that with my family.
Mm,
Likewise, it was 3 days after Brandon's passing. He had been climbing on a mountain with buddies, and he had collapsed. We had no cause of death, didn't know what
mm,
had gone on, and I spoke to my uncle 3 days later when I was in the mortuary. And my uncle had similar abilities to my father, and my dad had already been gone for 12 years at this point. And this is more of a medium mystic thing. But my uncle said, "Hey, Mark, I wanted to let you know something." He said that he got up that morning. He was meditating. My father came to him, and he said he was there when Brandon, my son, passed, and he helped him adjust. Brandon was a little
mm,
confused, but my dad helped him adjust and cross over. Um, Brandon wanted us to know we were the best parents he ever could have had, which is the nice thing we like to hear. But then I got the evidence right after that, and my uncle said, "Your dad said Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen that drew down his blood oxygen levels and causes heart to fail." And then 2 days later, I got a call from the physician who had done the autopsy, and she said that Brendan died from a severe asthma attack that drove his blood oxygen levels down and caused cardiac arrest. So
wow.
that was kind of the next domino in terms of experiences that really had an overwhelming effect on initially our immediate family, but also then friends, and kind of became another catalyst for me digging deeper and diving deeper into this whole realm.
Hmm. So it seems from what you're saying, it seems to like run in your family. Like not only your dad was this famous medium, but also you also had other family members who were tuned in, you would say?
It's common that way, yeah. The
Yeah.
people that research this find that it runs in family lines. I don't know how much of that is the socialization aspect or how much is genetic or a combination of the two. But I know that it goes back as far as on my father's grandmother. She read tea leaves, and on my then his mother actually became a trance medium after he had gotten involved and began displaying some phenomena at a young age.
Hmm.
And then even on my mom's side, my mom to some degree and my aunts more so seem to have at least some psychic capacity as well. So yeah, it does run in family lines.
Do you think that's an energy thing? Is that something within the pineal gland, which, they say relates to, intuition and secretion of all these kind of hormones? Like, why do you feel that works where some families they may have more intuitives or psychics, or sometimes it skips a generation? Like, why do you feel that is this way?
I'm not certain. In my dad's book on psychic development, he talks about the pineal gland and that, that could be the source or why it works physiologically. still we're coming kind of back to a materialistic explanation with that, but it doesn't. The way I view it is, and maybe you could call it dualism, or maybe it's not, or maybe we're all one thing, but part of us is material and part is something more refined than material. And that part goes on. But I think that the pineal gland could be like the filter of what the consciousness is delivering. And it can perhaps be less refined in terms of how much information gets through about external things than the average person. So I don't know for sure. That's one thought. It could be that. I think it has something to do with energy too. Like certain people have more of this kind of energy, whatever that energy is. They exude that, and they're able to connect. Maybe spirit connects with them more directly because maybe it's like a beacon of light or something to those on the other side. All I can do is speculate.
Yeah, it could also be a nature-nurture debate where literally families are nurturing this gift to their kids. They're not stigmatizing it, and their kids are able to own it, and it just becomes, you know, kids are born normally very intuitive, and when that's destigmatized and when they're honed in on it, they could develop it. So it's hard to say like this is the specific reason, but yeah, it's always been fascinating. But Mark,
Well,
I'm sorry.
in case of my dad, though, it was really the other way around because his father did not like these abilities, didn't like my dad making predictions, even though they came true, didn't like the social stigma. And, he suffered for it as a kid growing up. So he was not nurtured really at all. In fact, it became more a rebellion thing for him. The other thing that's interesting to notice, some of the people that researched this have found that a lot of people who are really gifted or have a high degree of this have suffered some sort of trauma in life, whether that's abuse, whether that's some sort of severe accident or whatever. A lot of them had something. So it's like it jarred something and shifted something in them. So that's an interesting caveat as well.
Yeah, it's just kind of like a shake-up period of the mind, body, and soul that gets us on a new direction, and that happens in many different ways. I'm wondering for you, was there a point where you said, Mark, I gotta do something about this. I gotta like get into the afterlife field. Was there a point where you just kind of knew that this was the path that you were able to walk? Like, how did that all formulate for you?
For me, this is really crazy, but it kind of just evolved. I didn't really go seeking it. It sought me.
Mm,
That's how I feel about it, because after Brandon passed, I thought I need to do something constructive. I need to do something that's going to help me put my focus in a positive thing. And what I started doing was I was going to write a biography about my father. So I got going on this. And as I was proceeding, I hired an editor from New York City, and she started looking over the material. And the preface really to the book was what had just happened to me. I was using that, saying this is the catalyst for that. And then I went into my dad's material, and she said, "Hey, Mark, I've got a thought for you." She said, you could write your dad's biography anytime. I think you have your own story to tell. Maybe you want to consider that. So then that kind of opened my mind. The next domino, I guess, was 3 weeks after Brandon passed. I was watching the local news in Phoenix on the NBC affiliate, and they showed a feature about a mediumship testing process being conducted at that time at the University of Arizona. And the medium that was being done with was Alison Dubois, who was virtually unknown at the time, but later became famous because of the network show Medium. So she was separated from the sitters, could not directly communicate with them or see them, and had to give messages to them about a discarnate individual who was identified by the researcher by first name, asked a series of questions. And I was really impressed because she wasn't just saying, "Oh, grandma's here, loves you very much." It was like highly specific stuff about this person. Then they debriefed with the sitters afterwards, and the sitters were like, "Hey, this is all right on the money." And they kind of elaborated on the comments that had been made by Allison. So I thought to myself, wow, I'd love to get a reading from her, and I'd love to be in that lab someday. And both things later happened. In fact, the very next day, I got a call from a man named Jerry Concert, who had been friends with my father. He lived in Dallas, Texas, so he didn't even know about the clip that I had just seen. He calls me and says, "Hey, Mark, I know what you've been through. I know someone who might be able to help you, and her name's Alison Dubois. Here's a phone number you can call to get a reading." So I'm like, okay. my dad or somebody's helping this line this stuff up for me.
Right.
So that was kind of next up. And then I did, within a year, I was a sitter in that lab for a Discovery Channel feature. And actually, there's a clip of it on my website. I'll give you the address later, but people want to check that out. They could see it. It's about a 2.5 minute clip about how that process was working at that time.
Mm.
So that was kind of the next thing. And then she was still very popular at the time, even though the network show hadn't come out yet. So I had to wait till August for my reading. 2 weeks before I had the reading, I met with a man who gave me a box, and inside the box was a bunch of 8.5 by 11 type pages. It was a manuscript that said "Your Psychic Potential: A Guide to Psychic Development," Richard Ireland, 1973. I'm like, well, where'd you get this manuscript? He goes, well, you were out of state at the time, and your dad was getting ready to pass, so he gave it to me for safekeeping.
Wow.
I said, yeah, but that's been 12 years. Why are you giving this to me now? And he said, well, I just feel I'm supposed to. 2 weeks later, I have the reading with Allison, and one of the first things she says is, I have your father here, and he showed me a book, but I
Wow.
believe it's his book, and he's handing it to you to take forward. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I think I get that. And I later got that book published too.
Wow. Wow. And Allison is just a blessing from heaven, and she's so spot on. We love the Dead Life podcast and all that she does. She's amazing. But I'm sure hearing that valid piece of validation puts you on that, path that you say, yes, I should go forward with this, publish this. And it's just so significant the impact that a medium could have when they're evidential, the information that they could have, and how that could allow you to really move forward. And it seemed like that was a way to honor your dad and some of the
Mhm.
projects that he started for you to complete
Yeah.
them. I'm sure he was grinning ear to ear, as I'm sure he always was with you for the most part, but that must have been something.
Yeah, I'm open to the idea of pre-birth planning. I don't know if that's real or not, but it seems like there might be something to it. Maybe I had an agreement with my dad before I ever came here,
Mm.
and to pick up where he left off, where he couldn't finish. But I would say, that reading was loaded with affirmations and great, a lot of contact with my son as well. So it was a very healing reading. But that one thing with my dad and other things about my dad she shared really made me feel like he was partnering with me really from the other side and helping me like line out this path that was unfolding in front of me moving forward. And then just more and more things happened. I met more people in the field and got more messages. There was a medium named Linda Williamson in England who was really well known. She's retired now, but I met her through some other folks in the research field, and actually met her in England once. Was invited to go to a mediumship event, and met her and became friends. Well, even before that, I found out about her, and she gave me a reading, and it's actually there's information about that shared in my first book, Soul Shift. But she back then was saying, Mark, what you're doing is just going to unfold naturally. You don't have to do anything other than be yourself, tell your truth, share it with people. And this thing will unfold. It's going to become massive and worldwide. And today, if that's helping parents heal, we have 26,000 members. We have 165 affiliate locations around the world. And like I said, we have a conference every other year with 1,000 people coming. So that's pretty big.
Yep.
It's interesting looking back on that. Even then, she said, some things unfold not in the time frame we want them to or expect them to, but it's going to happen in the time frame it's supposed to. And I remember being very impatient back then, like a year or two later, like, what is this? When is this going to happen?
Mm.
But that was really quite a while ago. So, but it all came to be just as she said it would. And I'm happy to serve in this way. I'm not per se a scientist, although I like the scientific method. I try and follow it to the best I can for the things that I'm involved with, but it's really more to provide service to people. So if someone's looking for a medium, for example, I help vet them so that they can have a list of qualified people to go to, as opposed to just people being thrown to the wolves and, Googling something and hoping for the best.
Yeah, you do. It seems like you do a lot of research. Correct me if I'm wrong, on mediums and just the study of mediumship. But I'm wondering for you, like, what prompted you to start to get into the research end of things? I mean, obviously, having readings from people like Alison Dubois could be life changing, and it seemed like that was certainly the case with you, that the life that you're living. But what specifically prompted you to try to give more credibility and just basis to really kind of vet some of these mediums?
My dad was always interested in the research side too, and I know that he was tested. I'm having a hard time pulling all that data together now, so many years later. But I made contacts with people in different parts of the world that do the research, and
Hmm.
I have pretty good feeling that he did connect with them and had been tested. But I think his interest in it was partially part of it because I felt like I wanted to continue his legacy. I think the biggest thing though was after my first book, Soul Shift, came out, people started coming at me looking for references for mediums because they wanted to get a reading. Well, at the time, I knew maybe half a dozen of them, but they were all good. It's just some of them were celebrities. They had a long wait lists, and some charged more than some people wanted to pay.
Right.
So I thought, there's got to be other people out there with these abilities that just are more unknown. So I decided to try and put together a testing program, and then those who had passed the test could be certified, and I put up a website to feature them. So I reached out at the time. Aside from U of A, I did connect with Dr. Emily Williams Kelly at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. That department was founded by Dr. Ian Stevenson.
Mm.
He was a researcher of reincarnation, and he did a lot of really top-notch research over the years. And then Jim Tucker took that over and is doing that research now. And then Dr. Bruce Grayson was in that department doing all the near-death experience research. And Dr. Emily Williams Kelly was doing a little bit of this mediumship research, and I became a test sitter for her in one of her tests. So I came back to her and said, hey, I learned about her protocols, basically. She explained to me what she had done. And then I took that, and then I went to another friend of mine, a researcher, Tricia Robertson, who had been the president of the Scottish Society of Psychical Research, to kind of refine this for my own purposes. Because again, I wasn't trying to get journal articles published. I was just trying to separate the wheat from the chaff to give people good resources that they could depend on. And what we came up with, and I've actually refined it about 4 times since I started it 10 years ago, upping the bar each time. But someone who applies for this certification, they have to provide 5 different readings in blinded fashion on Zoom with no video. They're not told who they're going to read for. At the time it starts, they're given the first name of the person, and that's all. And then they just go into giving the reading. After 10, 15 minutes, the sitter can ask to hear from a specific person, mentioning a first name only. And then basically the whole reading's recorded, transcribed by the sitter, and then the sitter has to grade it and break all the statements into individual statements that can be graded as correct, incorrect, or indeterminable. And then they can subjectively provide bonus points if they feel something warrants it, if it was specific enough and meaningful enough to them. And then basically there's a statistical process where they have to do well enough statistically to pass. And then if they do, they're added to the site. Today, almost 10 years later, I've got 41 people on there, I believe. And the passing rate now is probably only 15 to 20%, something like that. And I actually see that as a good thing, because what it tells me is we're getting the cream of the crop that are crossing the finish line. And it doesn't mean that other people don't have the ability, but it might be hard for them under those controlled conditions to really do the job. And then there's also some people who are a little deluded about the level of their ability too. So that's really what started me down the path to do that, put that program together. And it's been helpful. And in all that time, I've only received 1 email from someone complaining about any medium on the site. I was afraid I was going to get a lot more than that.
Well, that just shows, the how effective the testing process is and the credentialing process is, and but more importantly, how significant it is, because we have to bear in mind that these aren't just people going into readings. These are very oftentimes hurt people, traumatized people. We just don't know how badly they're drowning. And as a therapist, I understand this, but as a medium, they could be that one solid piece for them to hold on to. And we just, and so for them to make sure that they're evidential is key, because, people could be psychic, but doesn't mean that just because you can play a couple of keys on the keyboard that you're going to perform at a wedding for somebody. You have to
Right.
do it on a professional level, because people are counting on you, and also everyone could throw out that shingle, that name, and it's a big responsibility. So, I do validate you, and organizations such as Forever Family Foundation, which I'm
Mhm.
also a part of, that do this, because I think it gives the work a lot more responsibility, credibility, and puts people in grief in better positions to really know that it's evidential and not just kind of question, or people that could take advantage over their bereaved state.
And just so people know too, I'm not a 501c3. Helping Parents Heal is, but I've not sought to raise money for my mediumship certification. I've funded everything myself. It's cost me thousands of dollars to set up the site, have it, rebuilt and expanded and changed and modified over the years. And then my own time, and I have a volunteer, Kathy Rook, thanks to her, that the two of us do everything. She does the scheduling, she sets up the test readings, and then the grading, the scoring, and all that. That's all. We're just doing that. I receive nothing. I don't get a piece of what they're paying the mediums. The mediums don't pay me. I don't want there to be any question about that. So I would just want people to know that as well.
Yes, it's all from the goodwill and to make sure people are put in the best hands possible. So I do thank you for that. It's very generous and kind of you to give that service. Now, Mark, you mentioned Helping Parents Heal. I mean, I know I've been involved with them, and I'm going to be presenting at the conference in August. But I'm wondering for you, how did that start with you? Being the co-founder of Helping Parents Heal, how that all began? Because I know I'm friendly with Elizabeth Boisson; she's been on my channel. But how did the two of you connect and start this wonderful organization?
Sure. It was kind of another synchronistic story. So it goes back to 2008, I'm sorry, 2009 or 2010. I was doing a workshop at the time, actually sharing the content of my dad's psychic development book, partnering with a medium friend, Jamie Clark. And during a break, a woman approached me. Her name's Suzanne Wilson. And Suzanne said, hey, I'm actually a medium, practicing medium, and I just moved here to Arizona from Florida,
Yeah.
and I came to this event to meet like-minded people.
Mm.
And she says, ironically, I just read for a woman whose son also passed away on a mountain. And I said, well, you know what? Why don't you give her a copy of my book, and here's my contact information. Maybe that will help her. And if she wants to talk, I'm happy to talk. A day or two later, I get this call from Elizabeth Boisson, and she says, Mark, I read your book in one sitting. I loved it. I want to meet you and your wife. So we arranged a meeting. We met for a happy hour dinner or something. And she said, you know what? I've got this group on Facebook called Parents United in Loss. And, it's just been a Facebook group for now, but I'm going to have my very first in-person meeting in Carefree or Cave Creek in a week or two. Would you be my first speaker? I'm like, sure, I'll be happy to do that. So I go to this first meeting. There's 30 or 40 people there, and it went well. And then she started doing these once a month, but it was just one group in one location. And fast forward to 2011, I was leaving a corporate job, trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And another medium friend, as I said, I know a lot of them. This one's Tina Powers out of Tucson, excellent medium and great person, wonderful.
You have a large group of mediums.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was a former newscaster there in Tucson, and she always had these abilities. But one day she had to do a field reporting of a young man, a teenage boy who had been shot and killed. And when she was staying there on the curb, thinking about the father who had to come there or witness this, it just really took her back. And she says, I'm not doing this anymore. And she quit that and became a medium full time at that point.
Wow.
So anyhow, Tina said to me at this point, she says, you're leaving this job. She says, I think, Mark, what your real mission in life is to help other parents who have been through the same thing as you. And maybe you could think about forming an organization to do this. So I mulled it over and I thought, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. What Elizabeth established as a single group works well. It just needs to be blueprinted and then taken out and replicated in other locations. Also, she doesn't have a website. I could help her put a website together, and she doesn't have a newsletter. I could help her with that. So I called her up and I said, hey, would you be interested in taking this thing to another level? And I'll help you put a newsletter together, a website. And And she goes, "Oh, that'd be great. Let's do it." And I said, "And maybe a name change? How about like something like Helping Parents Heal?" And she goes, "Oh, I love that name. I didn't like the other name." So that's how it started. And then the board members, our initial board was made up of people who were at the first meetings that had become regulars. And then that's changed over time. But we just started this off. It started a little slow, but it didn't take long before it caught on. And then all of a sudden we have affiliates popping up all over the place. And to the point where now it's become this massive thing to where Elizabeth and Irene Vuvalides pretty much run the operation day to day. I'm chairman of the board, but I'm not really involved in the day-to-day operation. They are, and they're working crazy hours. So we're getting to the point where we do actually need to raise funds to support the organization, because we're going to have hired employees. We're at that point. So, but that's a good thing. It's sad that we're needed, but it's good we're there to help provide services to people who are there. And really the reason we exist is because there are other bereaved parents organizations, some bigger than us. I don't know how much longer they're going to be bigger, but we're the only ones that allow open discussion of spiritual experiences and afterlife evidence. And like I said before, that's one of the hope elements in the healing process. And if you ask people to bottle that up and just talk about their pain, some of these folks sit, for 10 years and they're not getting any better. They're just stuck in the same place. And you've probably seen that with some folks.
Oh, sure. Suppressed, repressed, you name it. So there's a tremendous relationship of grief and belief, and for allowing people to really process and own their experiences, with their own loss. And it seems like, that I'm Jewish, so we use this word basher, to like kind of meant to be, but it seems like you and Elizabeth were just the perfect match, where it seems like you guys complemented each other very well, and it all is synergizing now and it's exploding. But most importantly, it's helping people all over the globe getting the resources and support that they need, and to allow, mediumship, afterlife stuff to be utilized within their own grief journey. I think it's profound.
Yeah, we have a great working relationship. I mean, I have to give her credit, because Irene and her do all the work day to day, and they're out there all the time. And I think
Right.
her approach is very hands-on, very caring, very compassionate and supportive, very positive. So that her stamp is all over that organization.
Her
In terms of,
DNA, yeah, I think of Elizabeth, I just think of the heart. She's from the heart. She's an angel. She's the kindest, most empathic woman, and she's a tremendous leader. I see her as, and visionary. So she's great. I wanted to talk about another, at least in my eyes and many eyes, another leader and visionary, and I know you are. But you mentioned your father, and people speak about, John Edwards, Sylvia Brown as like pioneers within their field. But your dad was, from my understanding, one of the real first ones to do it on a grand scale, and working, in television as a medium. But could you explain a little bit about who your father was and what he really meant to the course of mediumship today? Because now you turn on the TV and everyone is, this medium, that medium,
Mhm.
it's like every nickname possible in the Webster's dictionary for medium. But your dad was really the OG of mediums in the, in the television era. But could you kind of like explain, him beyond, the limelight too, just how gifted and he was
Right.
too.
Well, yeah, he precedes all those people you mentioned. I would say he was in the
Oh
generation
yeah.
of, and maybe a little after, like Eileen Garrett and Arthur Ford. Those are two big names from the 20th century that I think were highly capable mediums. And my dad was, I would say, equally gifted. He was in that realm, in that grouping, if you will. Really, to start at the beginning, I actually interviewed my grandmother after my dad had passed, and found out, she said that she first saw the signs of this in him at age 3. And he would know when his grandparents were coming, even when there was no phone or anything. He would say, "Grandpa's coming," and within a certain period of time, Grandpa would be there. They even started planning meals around that. And then at age 5, my dad went into the Columbus, Ohio Children's Hospital for corrective surgery on his eyes, because he was born cross-eyed. After the surgery, he was in a bed, strapped down, because he had his eyes cupped and bandaged, and they were afraid he'd mess with the bandages. A nurse felt sorry for him and said, "I'll let you up if you promise not to disrupt the bandages." He agreed. She went on about her rounds, came back, caught him catching a ball, throwing the ball against the wall and catching it. And she thought, oh my God, the bandages have been removed, but they hadn't. So she was even more freaked out. And then she brought in doctors to observe this. Then they put him in a bed and did voice throwing exercises, and he solved all of those. And so that was kind of the real revelation to my grandparents that you got a unique son here. By age 12, he stumbled into a spiritualist camp, and he went in, and this minister, spiritualist minister, was about to give messages to the people in the congregation. So as he walks in the door at age 12, he had just lost a good friend. The friend had died in a car accident very recently. And so he goes in, and he's handed a piece of paper and a pencil. And the woman says, you want to ask a question on here? And he goes, I don't know what to ask. She goes, well, just say a message, please, and then write your name, and then fold the paper. And then they collected all the papers. The minister taped and blindfolded his eyes, and then began dipping into the papers and answering questions. Well, he got my dad's paper, and he says, Richard Ireland. And my dad says, I'm here. And he says, well, there's a young man that comes to me who has passed recently, and he's giving you a secret code name, and that name is Paisy. Well, my dad and his buddy would play in the creek, and they had these secret code names, and lo and behold, the secret code name for his buddy was Paisy.
Wow.
What a weird name. So my dad was blown away, and then the minister went on to say, someday you're going to be doing what I do. And then he did end up mentoring my dad, and at age 17, my dad was ordained in the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, and he became a traveling minister, demonstrating his phenomena, both psychic and mediumship, for a number of years. And then in 1960, he started his own non-denominational church called the University of Life. What he described was the golden thread or golden strand of truth that runs through all the religions. And that's really what he was about. He was not really into the dogma part of it as much. And he was more trying to, I guess, people to open their minds, demonstrating these gifts as something to make people reassess their ideas about reality and consciousness and who they really are at a deeper level. And then, he went outside the bounds of the church doing TV shows and independent organizations, and then even nightclubs and things like that. He always said he wanted to go where people were. Some people would never set foot in the church, so he wanted to go out to them and open minds, and he did. I've got so many responses from people over the years. It's just phenomenal. But his practice ended up being very similar in terms of his psychic demonstration. And there are some people who have historically done this in a gimmicky way by putting like coins over their eyes and a blindfold, and then they learn to bulge their eyes out and look down. But my dad used 10 strips of Johnson & Johnson medical tape, which is highly sticky adhesive, completely opaque, 3 black blindfolds that were opaque over that, 2 strips of tape below, so you could never accuse him of looking down. It was really overkill. It was ridiculous. And then when you get the questions, he would go way beyond what was on the paper. One of the ones that gives people a kick was on my wife. When we first met, our second date, I was running late, and I said, I was 19 years old. I said, would you like to go to a movie? You want to go to a disco? You want to see my dad's psychic demonstration? She goes, oh, let's go see that. So I'm running late. We get there. He's already giving messages. He's fully taped and blindfolded, doesn't know I'm coming. So I said, why don't you write a question? And she goes, what should I write? I just asked for a prediction about something with the future. So she asked, will my mother ever get married? Because her mom had been divorced for a number of years and been dating a guy, but was really non-committal to him. So she sends the question up, and someone takes it up. And eventually he gets to he says, Susie Sap Soup. Her last name was Sipe. And she says, here. And he says, well, I believe you've asked me about your mother and if she's going to be getting married. Well, I don't know about your mother, my dear, but you have made your choice of men, and he's with you here tonight. And then I spoke up and I said, Dad, this is Mark. Susie's my date. And he says, oh my gosh, I just married off my own son.
Wow. Wow. So I'm friends with a couple of kids of, famous mediums and stuff like that. But I'm wondering for you, like, what was that like growing up with someone who's a celebrity status, but also happened to be a medium at maybe a time where, mediums aren't viewed the way that they are today, where everyone wants to be one. I'm sure, back then there was a lot of pushback. I mean, for
Oh
you,
yeah.
I guess it's all you know in this lifetime, so it's nothing to compare it to, unless remember other lifetimes. But I'm just wondering what that childhood was like. I mean, did kids like kind of come to you asking, trying to be friends with you to get a reading with your like? I'm just wondering what that was like. I mean, was it accepted, stigmatized? Like, how did that all go about?
It varied. I'd say most kids were really interested and would ask me a lot of questions about what it was like and does your dad predict the future for you and blah blah blah. There were a few that were kind of like hardcore fundamentalist kids who were brought up in that kind of tradition,
Mhm.
and they were like, "Oh, that's bad stuff," And I would say, "I don't think so." There's a lot of stuff in Scripture about these gifts being a very positive thing and a gift from God, and that's how my dad views it.
Right.
So it was kind of varied, but it was interesting. I would say he had to present it more outside of the church as entertainment, especially on TV and things, and more the psychic part of it than the mediumship part, because the world really wasn't ready for that at the time. So, like the best demonstration I have that people can see, it's when he was on the Steve Allen show in 1971. There's a clip of that on my site. People can go to check that out. It's actually two segments, two 10-minute segments, but that really will show people how it worked. And while he reached maybe a dozen people with messages that were highly specific and giving them information that's not even written down, I just would tell people, when you see that, you have to recognize if that was a normal demonstration in a room, there might be 100 people in there. He would reach like 50 of them.
Hmm.
So there's no way you could fake that or remember all that stuff, even if you had known who was coming or anything. And people were deeply, deeply touched. One of the craziest things that I've ever received in terms of a story or feedback about my dad was I was promoting my first book, and I had a speaking event. The venue was jammed to capacity. A woman came by and she says, "Hey, I wanted to let you know, I saw your dad and I've written down." She actually gave me a typewritten thing about her story. And then she told me verbally, she says, "I want to tell you a story about your dad that's really, very interesting." She says, "I first saw your dad in 1963, and, he taped and blindfolded his eyes. He asked us to write a question, and I was trying to think of what to write. And I thought, well, I'll either write a question asking him if I'll have a fourth child or if I'll get my master's degree." And she said, "So I only wrote down the one about the master's degree. I sent it up. And toward the end, he said, 'Oh, yeah, Norma Poling, you'll get your master's degree.'" And she later did.
Wow.
Well, 5 years passed and she came back again. She hadn't seen my dad for 5 years. She writes a brand new question this time, sends it up. My dad gets her paper and says, Norma Poling, oh, I see you had that fourth child.
Hmm.
Now, that's a question she'd only thought of 5 years earlier and never wrote down.
Hmm.
It's kind of crazy, huh?
My God. Remarkable.
That tells you
Remarkable.
something about also the nature of what our perception of time is. And maybe on
Right.
the other side, it's not quite the same as we think of it here in
It's
this.
it's it's much different.
Yeah.
But I mean, talk about ethical. I mean, he had, blindfolds over him and stuff like that. I'm wondering what he would think of now where you're seeing these reality shows of Medium and everything is doctored, edited, they cut out, the stuff. So seems like a real ethical man who was certainly well beyond his time, it just based in principle and just good ethics, which you don't see as much with, mediumship demonstrations on TV or stuff like that.
Yeah, I think if when you see the clips that I've got on there, they're not edited. I mean, that was way before the day that was live TV.
Real
It
and
was
raw.
actually
Yeah.
I got it on 16 millimeter film, and then I had it moved over to digital recording so I could put it on YouTube. But yeah, it's disappointing that happens.
Mhm.
I know skeptics have done just the opposite. In my second book, The Persistence of the Soul, I have a chapter on skeptics and about some of the debunkers and some of the games they've played. Like they would have psychics and mediums, and then they have skeptics, and they'd film, information taking place, and then they'd edit out all of the evidential stuff to make it look like the mediums were frauds. So it
Mhm.
goes the other way too. But
Goes both ways, right?
yeah, it's very frustrating. I guess the only way you can, know for sure is to have your own reading live, or to go to a gallery reading that's
Mhm.
happening live with someone who does that. I some like someone who does that on the East Coast that's very good is Maureen Hancock and
Mm.
also John Holland. And there are others that do this with big groups. I know Allison Dubois used to. I'm not sure that she's doing those as much now. I
I
think
think
she's doing other things.
I think yeah, Joe's pursuing his PhD and I think aerospace something like that. So she's taking a break, but she's done enough. Tons of demonstrations groups. She's the best to me, in my eyes, and many. Now, Mark, my last question is: you mentioned your new book, "The Persistence of the Soul." Can you tell us a little bit about the second book and how it differentiates from your first book, and any key points for viewers? Because I've been hearing a lot of wonderful things about it, and
Yeah. It's
tell us a little bit
reflecting.
about. It's a beautiful cover too. I
Thank
love it.
you. Yeah. Um, the first book, Soul Shift, which looks like this. I don't know if it's gonna.
We're able to see it. Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah. There we
I
go.
like that. It's very earthy. Yeah.
That was my older son's graphic design that we incorporated in that.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
my new publisher, Traditions, they came up with that cover, and I absolutely loved it. So
I
I'm
do
happy with
too.
both book covers. But the first book was really more a lot of the things I talked about today. It was my journey after Brandon passed. It was kind of going back through my dad's lineage and how I was brought up and the things that I saw that stuck with me. And then it went into some personal direct experiences we had. Some I hadn't even touched on today that were mind blowing in terms of Brandon making himself known. And then a series of 4 readings with top mediums and chronicling those and all that. The next book, though, so that was more of a personal journey, a memoir. The second book does continue with personal experiences, but the difference here is that I added in more research and scientific information supporting my story. So I'm giving these stories of my experiences and then kind of the research that's been done and the scientific evidence supporting those kinds of things. And in other chapters, like the one you brought up about, these phenomena in history and religion and things like that. So I'd say Jane Catra, I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she's been in this field too. And she worked with Russell Targ a lot on his work and co-authored books with him. But she said she views this as a scholarly book. And she really made me feel good in terms of her comments about it and that it was kind of a seminal book in terms of doing for mediumship what some other books have done for near-death experiences and after-death communications, reincarnation research. So I tried to make it an educational book, but also readable and enjoyable for those who want the personal stories. So if you're more into the science and the research, it's there. If you're more into the personal stories, that's there. You could skip one or the other. And some people like the whole enchilada.
It's all there. Now, you mentioned the crossover of religion and mediumship, um, which many times something fell. There's a stigma that religion has towards mediumship, where they'll say, "Oh, it's playing with the devil and stuff like that." But you found there's some crossover of examples of mediumship found within history and religion. You say?
Yeah, it's interesting. I find less of that coming from the Jewish community, less of it coming from the Catholic community, more with Protestantism, but more that the fundamentalist factions.
Mm.
And it's ironic, but they're more going to point towards Old Testament chapters like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that put down mediums and say that. I think it was more of a cultural thing back then, where they were trying to guard their own tribe and keep people from defecting or whatever, because those same chapters say that slavery is an acceptable practice and that if you have a disobedient son, he should be taken to a neighboring town to be stoned to death. So if you're saying, is this supposed to be a loving God?
Yeah, we thankfully, some people are still living in the Stone Age, but most of us have evolved from a lot of those practices and take what makes sense in these times and have been able to filter out some stuff that might have been applicable practices, but now we've really learned from some of those. But yeah, within at least my faith, the Jewish faith, I could speak of within the ultra Orthodox tradition, everything's a problem, including this kind of stuff. But I speak to most people who are more moderate and stuff like that. It's embraced, it's applauded. So you're spot on with that.
One of the statements I got that was pretty amusing. My dad was part of the interfaith movement in Phoenix, and he was friends with a rabbi, Plotkin, who was well known. He was like the most prominent rabbi in.
I've heard the name. Yeah, it's a very common Jewish name, but I think I've heard of him before. Yeah.
So the two of them went to see the play Jesus Christ Superstar, And at the end, Plotkin gets up and he's doing a standing ovation. My dad looked at him and he says, "Well, he was one of us after all."
Right,
but
right.
there are some positive things in the Old Testament too, like the story. I would say the story of the medium of Endor really puts a more positive light on the medium and a lot less on Saul.
Mm.
I won't get into that whole story, but it's in that chapter if someone wants to read it. And then in the New Testament, for those open to those stories, there's a lot of these things that happen. And the Apostle Paul, he mentions the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And if you read them, there are all these things, the prophecy, discerning of spirits. They're all the stuff. It's the same
Right.
stuff.
Oh,
And then all
sure.
the stories about Jesus with the miracles, their clairvoyance, the woman at the well in John, the materialization of Moses and Elijah witnessed by the disciples. That's mediumship. Sorry.
Right. What was called back then prophets are now called mediums and psychics. It's not like the gift was lost throughout
Right.
civilization or society. It's just a different terminology, that they used it that time, and it's still applicable in today's age. But yeah, Jesus Christ Superstar, Andrew Lloyd Webber, one of my favorites. Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting too. I think really from what I've learned, a lot of that whole thing about saying that's bad or evil comes back to really the split between science and religion.
Mm.
After people like Galileo were um, treated poorly, and all that's caused this division of the Enlightenment period. So you had at some point, people on the science side saying, "Hey, your book says all these miracles take place, but none of you guys are doing any of that stuff today. Why not?" And then they would say, "Oh, that was reserved for that period of time. It'll happen again in the future, but nothing's happening right now."
Mm.
And that's a man-made story right there. There's nothing in scripture really supporting that. But that's kind of where a lot of that came from, and where the more fundamentalist factions, are leaning on to say, well, that can't really happen. So if it is happening now, then that's bad. It's, not from a good source.
Oh,
But like I say, one of the statements attributed to Jesus is, a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And I'd say, when a medium gives a reading that's healing to someone in grief, it's evidential, it's helpful, and gives them hope, that's good fruit.
mm. That's a beautiful last statement that you made, and it's so true. Information is so pivotal in our worldviews and our behaviors, and we're getting the right information that is evidential. It could totally change a life and how you view that loved one, that it's not just a complete stoppage, but there's continuity and there's room for a continual relationship and for yourself to move forward. Mark Ireland, a pleasure to have you. Where could people find you and your book and some of your work if people have personal questions? Is there the best place to reach you and to find your books?
Yeah, one-stop shop for you, because on here you not only find my books, you'll find other media that I've done. You'll find a link to Helping Parents Heal. You'll find a link to see my dad's videos if you want to look at those. Also a link to my certified medium site too. And all of that can be found at markirelandauthor.com. That's Mark with a K, author. I'm sorry, Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, author, markirelandauthor.com. I learned in advertising years ago, you have to repeat things 3 times for people to remember them.
I love it. Well, Mark, the son of a legend and someone who's making their own legacy in a profound way. And I just love the continuity that you're doing with your father's legacy. And it's amazing. I'm sure he's smiling all the time at your work, as so many are. We're lucky to have you on my channel. You're welcome back anytime. And thank you so much for the good work that you're doing for thousands of people.
Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
An honor. It was a wonderful conversation that we had here with Mark Ireland on my channel. He was really able to share a lot of his own personal anecdotes, stories, transformations, and powerful shift from incredible loss into purpose and meaning, and so much more. So, Mark was a great guest. And thank you for tuning in. For those of you who are new to my channel, please continue to be a part of our community by hitting that subscribe button, hitting that bell notification icon to stay up to date on a weekly basis for interviews coming your way. So thank you all for tuning in. Best wishes. Thank you.